to start with something a little more uplifting. How many of you like Dr. Seuss? Yeah? I personally like the Lorax a lot. He has a quote, "Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better." It's not. Hi, my name is Jackson, and I'm a first-year transfer student here at MTSU. When I moved here in June of last summer, I worked as an intern for Phil Bredesen's Senate campaign. It was my job to knock on doors or cold call people trying to find volunteers for the campaign. And they were very particular with me that if I met somebody who identified as conservative or Republican, it was best to just simply end the conversation and move to the next. But part of the reason why I enjoyed my role is I'd never gotten to talk politics with the people of Tennessee before. So it didn't matter if they were conservative or liberal, Republican or Democrat, I just wanted to know what the people of Tennessee cared about. One woman I spoke with was a hardline Republican. She'd asked me if I was a student in school, and I told her that I was in fact. I had just transferred to MTSU, and then she told me this quote, "Don't let them tear down my history." And it resonated with me. I had a vague picture for what she might be talking about, but nothing clear. And after some digging, I came to the conclusion that what she must be referring to was Forrest Hall, the Army ROTC building just right outside. Many of you will probably walk past it on the way back to your cars. And the discussion really of changing the name of Forrest Hall. And that's what I'm here to prove, that Forrest Hall should in fact be renamed, and someday it inevitably will. So first we have to ask, who was Nathan Bedford Forrest, the namesake of Forrest Hall? To put it simply, he was a Confederate general. A kind depiction might look something like this, from the 1958 dedication speech given by the Dean of Students, Belt Keithley. During the Great War between the states, Nathan Bedford Forrest rose to heights of leadership, generalship, and fame that have not been eclipsed. It paints a noble portrait of the man. He was a war hero, a veteran. But although Nathan Bedford Forrest was in fact a general in the Civil War, he was by no means a hero. We have to unpack this a little bit more. Prior to the Civil War, Nathan Bedford Forrest was not some average Southern citizen who went to go and defend the South from the invading Northern Army in this ideological battle between Confederates and Federalists. Not by any means. He was a prominent slave trader prior to the Civil War. He had about $1 million invested in the slave trade. In today's wealth, that'd be about $27 million. We might call this an economic incentive. If he were to not get involved in the war and the South had lost, well, he might as well have just burned $27 million. So he had a very strong economic incentive to get involved, beyond just Federalists and Confederates. But more so, his actions during the Civil War. It's absolutely true. Nathan Bedford Forrest was a master on horseback. He was dubbed the Wizard on the Saddle. And he was rising from a private to a general. I mean, it was notable to say the least. But he was also the general at the Fort Pillow Massacre. As the story goes, there were about 500 to 600 Southern soldiers that were fleeing to the north. Nathan Bedford Forrest went to Fort Pillow, where they were camped out, with 1,500 to 1,600 cavalrymen, surrounded Fort Pillow, and watched as they rode in and slaughtered every person they could. Nathan Bedford Forrest had a kill them all, take no prisoners mentality. Certainly not merciful, and certainly not noble. But what about his actions after the Civil War? What do we think happened once the South had finally resigned? Well, he became the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, which from its inception has been violent. They rode through the streets to whip, cut people down, hang them from trees, to send a message to black people in this country that you may not be a slave anymore, but you're not on the same playing field as I am. You are not to vote, and you are certainly not to run for office. There's a word for that today. It's not simply racist. It's domestic terrorist. And I don't mean that to be hyperbolic. That's the definition of terrorism. Using violence to incite fear into the population to prevent them from participating in our democratic process. And it's domestic because it's somebody in our country doing it to somebody else in our country. That is the definition of domestic terrorist. And that's precisely what Nathan Bedford Forrest was. So why then did we choose Nathan Bedford Forrest in 1958? Well, this is a graph of every Confederate monument in the United States. And what we'll see is that, in fact, MTSU was sort of following a trend. You can see the most density of these monuments, and you can't really see the dates, but here in 1894 is Plessy v. Ferguson. Just a few years after that, we start to see a rise and ultimately a peak in 1911, 2 years after the foundation of the NAACP. And then, here, 1958, where we have the density of green dots, which are all the schools with Confederate monuments, which start going up after Brown v. Board of Education. There's a correlation here that when people of color start gaining rights in our country, white supremacists start putting up symbolisms to other white supremacists in order to send a message. This is what we call institutional racism. It's them recognizing that ideas are changing in our country. If you write your name on paper, you can burn it in an instant. But if you put it on the name of a building, that's going to take a whole lot longer. And at this point, I would hope that some of you are starting to wonder what can be done. Because it really shouldn't matter liberal, conservative, Republican, or Democrat. We should all be past this. We should all be in agreement here that a domestic terrorist like Nathan Bedford Forrest is not in our best interest. But if you're wondering that, you would not be the first. You could go through decades of action on this campus. Leaders in this community standing up and saying that something needs to be done and getting absolutely no response. That was until 2016 when these protesters sparked the creation of a task force on this campus to explore legal avenues in order to change the name of Forrest Hall. They ended up going to the Tennessee Historical Commission, which is a body of 24 people appointed by the governor of Tennessee. They vote whenever a monument of historical significance like Forrest Hall attempts to have its name changed. And they said this in response: the evidence presented showed that there was not clear and convincing evidence that this change is in the public interest, and there was not strong local consensus one way or another on the change. In short, no. Forrest Hall stands today. And I'd like to ask you all, members of the public, does this man represent your best interest? Is this the best that we can do? Or can we finally admit that we're past this? That we can do better? That someone like this does not unify us, but breaks us apart? And so I'd like to say, just one last time, that if you really do care, well, unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing's going to change. It's absolutely not. Thank you.